Aloha, everyone. Welcome. Happy to see people logging on. As we're letting everyone in from the waiting room, if you'd like to put your name and where you're joining us from today in the chat, we'd love to hear from everyone. And we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Looks like we have a lot of people still joining us. Welcome. Hey. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know a few people are still joining, and that's great. So as you join us, please use the chat box. Tell us who you are and where you're joining us from. And we're very happy to have everyone here today. My name is Kirsten Faulkner. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Hawaii Foundation, and I'm so happy to welcome everyone to the Hawaii Preservation and Practice webinar series. This is a training that we do in cooperation between Historic Hawaii Foundation and the National Park Service. And today's topic is archaeological investigations and their role in preservation. So very excited to have a really distinguished group of panelists today who are going to be helping explore this topic. Historic Hawaii Foundation is a statewide nonprofit organization. We were founded 50 years ago. This has been a great anniversary year for all of us. And basically, our mission is to help people preserve Hawaii's historic places. We've been doing that through advocacy, education, technical assistance, and protection of and on behalf of historic properties throughout the state of Hawaii. This program is managed by our education program manager, Andrea Nandoskar, and our development program manager, Michelle Kizik, is providing technical assistance as well. So mahalo to everyone on the HHF staff. This is a cooperative agreement with our National Park Service partners through the Preservation Partnership Program in the regional office that includes Hawaii. Most people know the National Park Service as their role for managing national parks, monuments, memorials, and trails and historic sites. But they also have a wonderful role in helping preserve and protect and promote the heritage of all of the many places in the United States. So we're very grateful to be working with NPS on this program as well. This program is available for certificate maintenance continuing education programs for the American Institute of Certified Planners. That's through a sponsorship with the American Planning Association Hawaii chapter. So mahalo to APA Hawaii for providing that. Any AICP members, you can log this to your certificate maintenance account. And it will be 2 credits because this is a 2-hour program today. So we do have a wonderful list of experts who are going to be taking us through this topic today. Peter Mills is a professor of anthropology and director of the Heritage Management graduate program at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. He is going to be giving us an overview about archaeology and anthropology and how this course of investigation fits into historic preservation overall. We also have Doug Wilson, who serves as an archaeologist with the National Park Service and is also an associate professor at Portland State University. Doug will be moderating our panel discussion with all of our speakers after the overall presentation. So we welcome him. Nicole Mello is the Hawaii Island lead archaeologist for the Hawaii State Historic Preservation Division. And she's going to be talking about archaeological investigations, the different kinds of reports, the different kinds of identification and mitigation measures and how those work. Seth Quintus is an associate professor in Department of Anthropology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He and Summer Roper Todd, who is a cultural resource program manager at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. The 2 of them have been working on a field school in the Ka'u field system on Hawaii Island. And they'll be presenting one of our examples, one of our case studies that will be looking at using archaeological investigation for the purposes of research, academic investigation, and public engagement and interpretation. So we welcome both of them. Our next example case study is by Mara Mulrooney, who is a principal and senior archaeologist with Pacific Legacy. She also has worked at Bishop Museum, as well as is a faculty member at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And this case study is going to be looking at an example at Kalaeloa, the former Barbers Point Naval Air Station on the island of Oahu, which is motivated by a compliance action for a development proposal. So we're excited to hear from her and how that investigation informed that development project. And then Iolani Kauhane is the former Maui archaeologist with the State Historic Preservation Division and is now working with Huliau Opa'a as part of a Native Hawaiian Wahi Kapuna Stewardship and Cultural Resource Management firm. So Io will be joining our moderated panel at the end as well. So I really want to thank all of them for providing their expertise, their time, their wisdom, their insights, and we're really looking forward to a great session with all of them. So we are planning on spending about 2 hours. The first hour of that's going to be more presentation, taking us through the topics of what is archaeological investigation, the definitions, the purpose, the types of reports, how you choose which one is appropriate, what the benefits are, how these reports and investigations can be used for the purpose of preservation and stewardship, what are some of the long-term benefits of that, and then of course those case studies and examples that I mentioned. Following those presentations, we've allocated quite a bit of time actually for discussion among all of our speakers. We thought there's some new and evolving issues and trends that we'd really like to talk about more. So as we go through this, please feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat box. We'll be responding to as many of those as we can in the time we have available, both during the chat and during that panel discussion and in the second half. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Peter Mills from the University of Hawaii at Hilo, who's going to take us through an overview of what is archaeology and why do we do it. So Dr. Mills, you can join us.
Hey, thank you, Kirsten. That's great. And so anyway, I'm really honored to be able to participate in this today and walk people through this a little bit. Kirsten, again, I'll be asking you guys to click slides for me, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. All right. So just a little bit more background. So I've been an archaeologist for, I graduated in 1984 back east at University of Vermont, and I've been doing archaeology pretty much since then in lots of different roles. At one point, I worked in a state historic preservation office back east, similar to the Massachusetts Historical Commission, and I've worked for not-for-profits. I've worked for private consulting firms. And here finally I am for the last almost 30 years working at University of Hawaii at Hilo as a professor. And I think most people, when they picture archaeologists and archaeology, they picture universities and that people are sitting here in a chair lined with books behind me and wearing glasses and hearing aids and, you know, sort of old sort of codgers hanging out in a university setting. But really, most archaeologists in this state, most of the wonderful people I get to interact with who are doing archaeology are out there in different roles in the community, whether that be with state agencies, with federal government roles, or with private consulting firms or not-for-profits. And so Seth Quintus, Dr. Seth Quintus, who's presenting today, is also at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And we're really the rare species. We're sort of the ones in the professor positions are relatively small from state to state. But let's get going on slides and talk about what it is that we do and what it is that we teach about. So first off, this is just a photo I took years ago that I love up at the Mauna Kea Adze Quarry. It's just one very small portion of a very large complex. And what I love about the photo is you can see the piles of tailings from making stone tools up on Mauna Kea. And you can also see uprights in the background right there by Pu'ulilinoe. And you get this sense almost of looking at it that someone might have walked away from this site yesterday. And really what archaeology is about is looking at the material evidence of how people lived their lives in the past. It's about people. It's not about dinosaurs. That's paleontology, which is a totally different field. And next slide. And One of the terms that the professors at Kahaka'ula Kolani, the College of Hawaiian Language here, used to sort of translate this Western term archaeology into Hawaiian is huli koe hana. Huli can mean to turn over, but it also means to study. Koe is remains and work. And I love this translation into Hawaiian for a few reasons. But it's looking at the work that people in the past had done and trying to understand from that work who they were, how they lived their lives, and having a way to, it's one of the ways that we can connect to these times that we can no longer see, touch, and feel in terms of the people, but the stuff that they left behind is still there. This is a slide I took of a good friend of mine, Derek Sakato, on the far left there. He ran a store out in Lapohoihoi, and his family had been living out in that area for generations. And off in the woods, I had been working with some people out there, and we had found these ruins. And I came to learn that the local name for this place was Sakato Camp. And I went out there, back still, yep, sorry, there it is. So Sakato Camp, and and it turns out that was his family, and he brought his whole family out there. Many of them didn't know that the ruins of that camp were still there, and it was a wonderful chance to connect past with present, and that ability to look at what was there, talk to their auntie, and ask questions about what these various things were. The combination of the oral history and the remains really brought to life a time that is difficult to do if it's just from oral history or just from writing. So the physical remains are a way to actually connect with community in many cases. And for these reasons, our society realizes that these places, even though they might not like fit into a museum, can be important to our community. Next. So something else about archaeology is about these physical remains and studying them to see what we can learn about life. And a lot of people associate archaeology with digging and immediately refer to digging as a destructive process. And for the fact that you're working in soil is sometimes when you are digging and exposing stuff, you can't ever like Humpty Dumpty put everything back exactly where it was before. And I think it leads to we archaeologists being obsessive compulsive people to carefully take note of what's there. But archaeology is also a chance to reconnect and expose. So in the case of, I don't know how many of you know about Pompeii in Italy, but a volcano went off in 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius. And what you're looking at here on the right is a very slow process of exposing that city by taking the ash off of it again. And here on the walls of Pompeii, you can see basically what's political graffiti from 79 AD, talking about different people who are out there in different political positions. And as you'll hear about later in this talk, Dr. Tess Quintus is going to talk about removing kikuyu grass, which sort of came into Hawaii in the 1920s as an introduced species for grazing, and stripping that off and seeing the remains of house platforms and agricultural systems in Ka'u. And so it's a chance, archaeology does in a sense expose things that are not necessarily visible on the surface sometimes, but a lot of archaeology is also completely non-destructive, where you're just mapping surface remains to try to figure out where important places are. And again, use that as a way to reconnect with the past. Next. So this word material culture, I force my students to sort of understand what material culture is, and it's basically more than artifacts. That's the point I want to get across in this. We break it usually into these, it's called artifacts, which is what looters like to collect and what people who like to put things in museum like to put on display. But then there's also ecofacts and features and matrix, and I'll sort of run through those in a little bit. But I want to introduce you to those terms. All of them are things that we as archaeologists are trying to collect to learn about how people used to live. But it sort of turns it into a science of studying all this stuff. But the point I want to make is that because it's dealing with people and it's just dealing with descendant communities, many of whom have been oppressed by sort of the dominant aspects of society, it's also a very humanistic approach. It's trying to understand and respect lives and times and people who might no longer be in power in the modern living society. This is a photo I took years ago back in the 80s at the Massachusetts Historical Commission. I used to work with the chief medicine man of the Wampanoag Tribal Council. His name was John Peters, who has since passed on. And the two of us would go out to various sites together and It would be John's decision many times of how we would sort of redesign something which was found in the process of development to try to preserve burials in place or other such things. And the relationships that I've had a chance to forge, not just with the material, but with the communities who are interested in those materials, is a really important part of doing good archaeology. And so one of the phrases that comes out of this is to nana ike kumu, Hawaiian sort of phrase, again, to look to the source, speak to the people who carry the sources of information, as well as working with the material itself, which is the direct connection to these people in the past. So archaeology is a science, but it's much more. Next. So again, I want to differentiate archaeology from looting and just collecting for the fun of having cool things end up in a collection somewhere. If you look at eBay or people are into collecting artifacts, the collector's side are interested just pretty much in the artifacts. And what you're looking at on the top left, that's a piece of gabbro. It's a special kind of stone that comes from deep underneath the volcanoes of Hawaii, and it's ejected up on the surface in some eruptions. And that gabbro right there has been turned into a stone weight for a luhe'e, an octopus lore. And it's filled with bright, beautiful, shiny minerals all over it. And it's the sort of thing you can sort of picture going like, ooh, I'd love to put that on my mantle. And it has monetary value in antiquities markets and things like that. But that sense of collecting for those things avoids the other three things I want to point out. Archaeologists want to find that luhe'e with something that they can date. So on the right, you can see a feature. It's just basically a place where there used to be a cooking oven in the ground, an earth oven, and imu in Hawaii and umu in Rapa Nui. And that has stuff that can be dated. And if that stone is found with that, we can figure out how old it is. But if they're found separately, we can't. Ecofacts are things like pollen grains. And so that on the left, it looks like a collapsed beach ball is actually a corn pollen grain, which I use from classes, but it would look like a big inflated beach ball if it was all filled up. And archaeologists in the American Southwest and in Mesoamerica are really interested in when that corn pollen grain starts showing up in sediments because it marks the beginning of agriculture compared to hunting and gathering in the past. And all of that stuff is found in this stuff that we call matrix, which is stratigraphic layers of sediments that build up around these artifacts, ecofacts, and features, all of which tells us about the passing of time. And we need to carefully take notes of all of these things in order to put all of this stuff in context. Next. So this concern with context is leads to, again, this reputation again of being OCD, right? Sort of like very careful in what it is that's going on. On the left there, back in my younger years, working up on Ke'anakolu on Mauna Kea with field schools, I'm collecting little bits of charcoal and mapping in exactly where they come out of inside of a lava tube, again, so that we can date them and identify the species. And everything we do seems to be when we are excavating is done in squares, you know, like where you put these holes in the ground and you're very carefully recording exactly where everything lies so that we can sort of keep track of where it is. We even made up our own word to refer to that sort of OCD of behavior, which is provenience, which is like this three-dimensional mapping of exactly where everything is. So that's the difference sort of in my mind between archaeology and people just go out and rip stuff out of the ground, say, hey, look at this cool artifact I found. Next. So as one of the things that I want to emphasize about this is that one of the things that we've done as far as field schools, or I've done here at UH Hilo, is worked on ranching communities up on Mauna Kea. And we have lots of good historical references for the 1900s. Dr. Billy Bergen, who's written the four-part series now on the history of the Parker Ranch, is like one of my sort of leading uncles out here for sort of understanding ranching history. But if you get back earlier, we don't have great notes on what's going on as far as ranching in the 1860s, 1850s. And this is one site that was on a map up on Mauna Kea that was just a pile of rubble that no one knew where it was at all. We had to clear off gorse, which is an awful invasive species, and we find the ruins of this house, of this station platform. And in that station platform, you can sort of see the coming together of all of these different ethnicities. What foods are they eating? How are they living their lives? How are they forming groups? And if you know anything about Paniolo culture, you've got Japanese cowboys, you've got Portuguese cowboys, you got Hawaiian Japanese, and all these mixes who come together, which is very different than plantations where you sort of had Portuguese camp, Japanese camp, all separate. And the very structure that's left behind to see how they were living and coming together and camping at night really reflects that, this sort of community space where everybody's working and telling story and talking story together. This one site that we're looking at here turned into a PhD for Dr. Ben Barna, who now works for one of the consulting firms in Hawaii. But this is sort of what it is on the academic side that we do. And when it comes into the public sphere, which is what most other people are going to talk about, which is it's basically saving these sorts of sites and preserving them so that we have the chance to come back to them and study them in the future. And that's it for my presentation.
All right. Aloha, my name is Nicole, and I'm an archaeologist for the State Historic Preservation Division. The State Historic Preservation Division is the regulatory agency for protection of historic properties in Hawaii. I will likely refer to the State Historic Preservation Division as SHPD throughout this presentation. Everyone else probably will too. All right, archaeological investigations in Hawaii are guided by Hawaii administrative rules, known as the 6E process. Section 106 is completed when there are federal lands or federal funds involved. The 6E process somewhat follows the federal process, but it is a little different. And for the sake of this presentation, I will be describing the reports and plans in terms of archaeological investigations in Hawaii that are guided by the 6E process. All right, next slide. Okay, so the types of reports and plans that we are discussing are the following: a literature review and a field inspection, an archaeological inventory survey, a data recovery plan, a data recovery report, a monitoring plan, a monitoring report, and a preservation plan. So based on Hawaii administrative rules, when an agency or a landowner proposes a development project, they have to go in for permitting. This could be grubbing, grading, building, there's a lot of different kinds. Or it could also be an agency proposed project. For example, say the county wants to develop a park. So whenever these projects are proposed, they come to SHPD for review. The State Historic Preservation Division reviews the permit application or proposed project. Then we will determine if archaeology needs to be completed in the project area or not. If SHPD recommends archaeology, it usually starts one of two ways, with SHPD asking for either a literature review and field inspection or an archaeological inventory survey. Next slide. All right, so SHPD will ask for a literature review and field inspection if we do not know of any prior archaeology on the parcel or in the area. So the purpose of an LRFI is to initiate the identification of historic properties or the potential to identify them in that project area. I'm clarifying this because a literature review and a field inspection is not in the 6E rules, but it is used to document historic properties non-officially though. So what happens is a landowner will need to hire a firm by the state of Hawaii to complete the work. The firm will do background research on the project area using various sources, which may include sources such as the SHPD Library, the Hawaii State Archives, Land Commission Award testimony, Hawaiian newspapers, historical maps, archaeological report. There's a lot of different kinds. So the LRFI background should be extensive enough to understand the background of the project area, but it does not need to be as in-depth as we would expect for an archaeological inventory survey. The background research should be completed prior to conducting a field inspection. Then the firm goes out to the parcel and conducts a survey, which is basically them walking around the project area and looking for archaeological sites or how likely it is to identify them. So the field inspection may not be 100% survey, but it will also include whether any ground disturbance has occurred on that parcel. And if even a single historic property, such as a rock wall, a mound, a small enclosure is identified at that stage, the firm will then need to complete an archaeological inventory survey. The background information and the research conducted during an LRFI can be used in an archaeological inventory survey. So next slide. So 276 covers rules for governing the standards of archaeological inventory surveys. An archaeological inventory survey is a thorough archaeological investigation that has key components. An AIS is completed to identify and document historic properties, archaeology sites, just to clarify that, meeting the current standards. This includes thorough background and historical research sections, prior archaeological investigations on the property and the surrounding area, archaeological pedestrian survey of the entire project area. Project area is referring to an area in which a development or a project may occur. It includes identification and documentation of all identified historic properties. This includes site mapping, photography, site descriptions, and it can include subsurface excavation. If excavation is going to occur, it will either be at an identified site, near it, or within the location of the proposed development. For example, if part of the development includes subsurface trenching and excavation for, say, electrical lines, SHPE may ask the excavation in the AIS to include the areas proposed for subsurface disturbance during the development project. This helps identify any potential historic properties prior to the proposed development subsurface. All right, the identified sites are then evaluated for significance. This includes assessing the site's integrity. There are 7 forms of integrity, which include materials, workmanship, feeling, association, location, setting, and design. The sites are assessed for significance under 5 criteria under Chapter 6E, which consist of criterion A, being associated with events that have made an important contribution to the broad patterns of our history. Criterion B, be associated with the lives of the persons important to our past. Criterion C, embody distinctive characteristics of a type, period of method of construction, represent the work of a master, or possess high artistic value. Criterion D, have yielded or is likely to yield important information for history or prehistory. And criterion E, have an important value to Native Hawaiian people or another ethnic group of the state. If a site is assessed as significant under criterion E, consultation must occur during the archaeological inventory survey. Consultation means the archaeological firm will need to reach out to descendant communities, community groups of the area, Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and any applicable groups. For example, if trails or a trail is identified, they will need to reach out to local trail groups, which include Na'alahele and Alakakai. The firm will then provide a summary of the consultation efforts in the archaeological inventory survey, and the consultation results must be considered while making decisions about the recommended treatment for sites. The report then recommends if there needs to be any additional mitigation prior to the project proceeding. Mitigation commitments can include archaeological data recovery, archaeological monitoring, and preservation. An AIS is completed during the identification stage. If no historic properties are identified during an AIS, the report is documented as an archaeological assessment. And then the project will either move forward, or archaeological monitoring will also be conducted if the area is of high concern for subsurface historic properties. SHPE must approve the archaeological inventory survey prior to the project proceeding. Next slide. Okay, so 279 covers archaeological monitoring. Archaeological monitoring can be completed for identification or mitigation. The purpose is to archaeologically observe and intervene with ongoing activities which may adversely affect historic properties. Archaeological monitoring is basically when a qualified archaeologist is present on site to monitor ground-altering activities to ensure if any subsurface historic properties are identified, the project will be stopped in that area, and an archaeologist can properly identify and document the newly identified historic property. Mitigation commitments will also need to be considered. Archaeological monitoring is guided by an archaeological monitoring plan. An AMP is written prior to any work starting on the project, and it must be reviewed and accepted by SHPE. An AMP includes monitoring provisions that are followed during monitoring activities. An archaeological monitor must be on site and watching the ground altering activities that are occurring. Generally, SHPE requires 1 archaeological monitor per piece of machinery. If archaeological monitoring is recommended based on the results from an AIS, the monitoring may be to identify any additional subsurface historic properties and/or to protect significant historic properties that are going to be preserved. Archaeological monitoring usually occurs in areas that are likely to contain significant subsurface historic properties. For example, sand dune areas in Maui are likely to contain iwi kupuna, and usually archaeological monitoring is recommended as a form of mitigation to ensure if anything is identified, the work in the area can stop and proper identification, documentation, and mitigation can occur. Archaeological monitoring sometimes occurs for identification in cases where there are likely to be no surface historic properties. For example, a school campus that has already been fully developed and has no surface historic properties, an AIS may not be as helpful in identification, but having a monitor on site during construction activities may assist in identification of subsurface historic properties should they arise during the project. When archaeological monitoring is complete, an archaeological monitoring report is written. An AMR includes if any historic properties were identified during the project. The AMR will also include the recommended treatment of identified historic properties. An AMR is written even if no historic properties are identified and will include a project summary, the firm that did the work, information on the stratigraphy in the project area, and any future recommendations for the project area. The AMR needs to be reviewed and accepted by SHPD. Next slide. So 278 is on archaeological data recovery. Archaeological data recovery is completed to gain additional information on previously identified sites, usually prior to development. The purpose is to archaeologically record or recover a reasonable amount and adequate amount of information as determined by the department from a historic property. Basically, data recovery is usually used to ensure we gather sufficient information at a site before the site is potentially impacted by the proposed development. Archaeological data recovery usually includes excavation, although it can also include additional documentation and research techniques, such as mapping and LiDAR. There are many forms, but usually it's a combination. Excavations occur at previously identified historic properties. Excavations can be manual or mechanical. Manual excavations usually consist of excavation units, like what you see in the photograph, although there are other forms such as shovel test probes. Mechanical excavation usually consists of machinery digging a trench to be examined by archaeologists. Prior to data recovery activities, a data recovery plan is written by an archaeological firm approved to do work in Hawaii, and then the plan is sent to SHPD for review and approval. A data recovery plan includes the specific sites that will be data recovered, research objectives, the methods that will be used during data recovery, and laboratory work. Laboratory work can include cultural material analysis, radiocarbon dating, EDXRF analysis. That's just a few examples. There's a lot of different types. After data recovery is completed, the archaeological firm that did the work will complete an archaeological data recovery report. The report shall include all findings from the data recovery, the research objectives, and the relevant information that was used to address those research objectives, mapping of the excavation, and the results from the additional research and laboratory work that was completed. For example, maybe during excavation, there was a significant cultural layer identified, and potential radiocarbon samples were identified in that cultural layer. Those samples will then be sent to a lab for radiocarbon dating. Once the results come back, it will give a few date ranges on the period of time of the site, and the information can be used to infer on that time period. So if they're going to do radiocarbon dating, it will need to be proposed in the plan, and it will need to be in the report. This is usually a result of research objectives. So basically, if you're going to do radiocarbon dating and you're looking for a period of time, one of your research objectives will be what period of time was this site in use. So once a DRR is accepted by SHPD, the project can proceed, or additional mitigation commitments may still need to be completed. Next slide. Okay, so 277 it covers preservation of historic properties. So preservation of historic properties is maintained in a preservation plan. A preservation plan ensures proper preservation of historic properties in perpetuity and in the public's interest. There are 7 types of preservation, which include conservation, stabilization, rehabilitation, restoration, reconstruction, interpretation, or appropriate cultural use. A preservation plan can be written by anyone, but it needs to be reviewed and accepted by SHPD, as all plans and reports do that are relevant to archaeology in Hawaii. A preservation plan includes the sites that are going to be preserved and the exact preservation measures that will be included. This includes short-term or interim measures. These are preservation measures that are implemented during construction activities. Interim measures include the short-term buffer around the site. Short-term buffers usually consist of bright orange construction fencing, so the buffer can easily be seen during construction activities. Other interim measures include placing avoidance instructions on construction plans. So once the project is complete, the interim preservation, or short-term, if there's buffers, they'll be taken down. So long-term preservation measures are for essentially the forever preservation of a site. Permanent markers for the long-term preservation can include things like native plants such as tea leaf, or sometimes it'll be rock walls. These buffers and commitments in the plan are to be honored by the landowner. They include long-term caring for the site, including the type of maintenance that will occur and how often, and what the site access will include, such as who can visit the site and if signage is going to occur. Preservation plans are usually a mitigation measure after a site is identified in an archaeological inventory survey. Although it's not always a result of that process. Preservation plans can be done in a proactive way. Say somebody owns a significant site on their property and they want it to be preserved, we can do a preservation plan in that way as well. A preservation plan is a beneficial document because it provides specific guidelines to be followed to ensure a site is protected, and non-compliance with a preservation plan can lead to possible violations. Additional details of the different types of reports and plans that I just went over is on the Hawaii SHPD website. So you can go ahead and look at that. And that's my brief overview. Thank you.
Right. We'll turn our attention a little bit to take a look at some case studies. So I am Seth Quintus. I'm from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'll be talking about our work in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park with Summer Roper Todd. And this is a partnership between UH Manoa and the MPS, so a federal state partnership. It's somewhat unique, and it's enabled by something called the CESU, the Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit. It's an agreement that allows the National Park System to conduct research using partners within the community. The focus of our work is on food production and social relationships on the Big Island. So next slide. On the left, the image that you're seeing is the Big Island with all the ahupua'a and the dryland field systems that we know about labeled. There's three major dryland field systems on the Big Island: Kohala, Kona, and Ka'u. There's a smaller field system, but it's a much more complex field system in Waimea that includes both dryland and wetland agriculture. These field systems are the breadbasket of pre-contact Hawaii, and so they provide valuable information on how people made a living in the past, but more importantly, they provide valuable information on how agriculture can be practiced in the present. A lot of what we're trying to do with our project is take a look at how people have practiced in the past and try to engage additional research, additional work in underutilized landscapes today. Quite a lot of research has been done on Kohala, the Kohala field system. A decent amount of research has been done on the Kona field system and the kinds of archaeology in those field systems. Very little has been done in Ka'u. An opportunity to do that research arose with the acquisition of more land by Havo, and I'll pass it over to Summer to talk about that.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Historic Hawaii Foundation for having us join as a case study, and for everyone joining today. Honored to be here. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of go over where we're at. We are on the island of Hawaii, as you can see by the map, and we're in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, our case study, which is located on the south side of the island of Hawaii. The park was established in 1916 as the 15th park in the system. And we have two of the world's most active volcanoes, Kilauea and Mauna Loa, 7 ecological zones. And the purpose of our park is to study and provide access to Kilauea and Mauna Loa, 2 of the world's most active volcanoes, and perpetuate endemic Hawaiian ecosystems and traditional Hawaiian culture connected to these landscapes. So we have a rich tapestry of overlapping historical themes in the park, as you could imagine by the large land size of our boundary. And we're focusing, as Seth mentioned, on pre-contact Hawaii into the early post-contact period with this project. So currently we have about 350,000 acres, but we didn't always have this amount of land. In 2003, the park acquired a pretty large portion of the Kahuku Ahupua'a on the Mauka side of Highway 11. Was a 2003 acquisition, and Highway 11 is the line in the bottom photo there. So you can see our site is located in the polygons right above the highway there. That's the Kahuku unit of Hawaii Volcanoes. And we have our administrative buildings pretty much right above that highway line that you see in the photo. So when we did acquire Kahuku, it doubled our land size. And so when we got that amount of land, we really needed to figure out, okay, where are we going to start our baseline documentation for historic properties? And so, it's a pretty big, massive land. We're a little bit overwhelmed. Where are we going to start? So just kind of how Nicole mentioned, we just started looking at our literature review, any kind of background history, oral histories, any previous surveys that had been done. Most of the landscape, the recent use was the ranch, right? So just trying to figure out where to focus our efforts. And that is when we discovered we did have an upper portion of the Ka'u agricultural field system within our boundary. And so that was someplace where we wanted to definitely get our baseline documentation, fulfilling our Section 110 responsibilities under the National Historic Preservation Act. And I think we can go to the next one. So as I mentioned, in number 1 is that Kipuka you saw in the previous photo, and Hawaii Belt Road is outlined in that top left. That's Highway 11, as I mentioned. So it's the upper limits of a very much larger field system, as you saw in that previous map that Seth showed. So the field system goes much lower. It's a pretty massive system that may be as large as 350 square kilometers. But as you can see, the 1887 lava flow did cover portions of the land. So that is just an estimate of the size. And you can go to the next slide. So one of our friends during our background research was satellite imagery. So as you see on the left, this is Kipuka Kaupapa. For those of you that are not here in Hawaii, Kipuka is where lava flowed around, and it's a remnant of land that did not get covered. So in the satellite imagery, you can see the walls, you can see the mounds, which was pretty exciting. And so the Park Service initially got out there and started doing feature identification and some of that early baseline documentation to identify the types of features we had, including the rock walls and mounds that make up the field systems. So on the right-hand side, you can see how we did the GPS, collected GPS data to have the location data of the sites located in the Kipuka, and we got our feature descriptions and just started doing that initial survey. And I think that's all for this slide.
All right, so this shows what these archaeological features look like on the ground. As Summer mentioned, the aerial photography is really important for identifying the location of potential archaeological sites. Once you get on the ground, this stuff looks very, very different. And so a lot of what this project is trying to use different kinds of technologies to undertake surveys, as Nicole mentioned, and document the full distribution of this material. The upper left image is showing a linear embankment, and these linear embankments, which you can see in an oblique image, so it's the bumps on the ground in that image. Those are field boundaries, but they also have agronomic functions. So they're really what are structuring the field systems, the agricultural landscapes. All 3 large field systems of Hawaii Island have those linear embankments, but they function differently. And so that's one of the things that we're investigating. The bottom left image shows a residential platform. It's actually the same one that Peter showed in his talk earlier. One of the things I wanted to show is how much grass is covering these platforms. And so we didn't know this platform existed in the park, even though the parks had the land since 2003. People have walked over this pretty consistently. This platform hadn't been recorded. Nobody knew it was there until this last year. And then we were able to uncover it. It has about between 15 and 30 centimeters of grass roots on top of it. And then you add the actual grass. And that's what you're seeing on the right-hand image there of another linear embankment, how much grass needs to be removed to get at the archaeological feature. Grass is both a good thing and a bad thing. And this is something that Summer will talk a little bit about on the next slide, but it can be really difficult to identify the full range and distribution of archaeological remains on the surface when you have this degree of vegetation. And So when you're doing a survey, that's why it's really important to use different kinds of technologies to record archaeological sites. But it's really, really important to recognize that some things are usually missed in surveys, and being honest about what is our visibility, how visible are the archaeological remains, and what's the chances or probability that some archaeological remains were missed during a survey. So I'll pass it to the next slide.
So yeah, just more images of what it looks like boots on the ground. This is an early image where you can see early after we acquired the land after 2003, where you can see the house site, the square on the left picture. So it's pretty obvious when you're on the ground if you're an archaeologist, I guess. So it's pretty exciting to see those on the ground. And then on the right-hand side are some of those mounds that you saw in the earlier image where we had all the dots, the GPS points. So as I mentioned, we just started getting out there and we did some early survey, and on the top right, we were trying to peel back that thick layer of grass to see what the features look like underneath. One of the challenges we have going forward in the future is, as I mentioned, this was a cattle ranch in the more recent history, and the cattle ranch, all the cows were removed. And so they actually helped keep the grass down and the invasive species, but now we're faced with a little bit of a management challenge trying to keep the Christmas berry and other things from coming in that may affect some of the rock walls and the sites. So yeah, as I mentioned before, and kind of piggybacking on Nicole's presentation, we are federal lands, and so we're required under the National Historic Preservation Act to complete our Section 110 surveys. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it is basically the inventory surveys to find out what you have. So you need to identify the historic properties within the boundaries of the land so that you can preserve and protect them, and that feeds into the Section 106 process. So when there's any kind of project or undertaking that's going to take place, you need to know what you have first so you know what could be potentially affected. And so that's where this project comes in, is to really gather that information, get our archaeological inventory survey completed so that we can protect the site going forward and consider it when any park project is proposed. Okay, next slide.
That's where I come in. Because I'm at a university, we structured this project as a field school. Field schools are essential for workforce development here in the state of Hawaii, as it is throughout the United States. Field schools are a baseline requirement for most jobs in archaeology. The problem is that field schools can be a barrier for those individuals entering the workforce. And so this field school that is sponsored by the National Park Service attempts to eliminate that barrier in Ka'u and the rest of the Big Island. We bring out 6 or 7 students each summer and spend about 3 weeks doing archaeological research in Ka'u. That archaeological research relates both to the Section 110 requirements of the National Park Service, as well as research questions that relate to the structure of the agricultural field system. So why are people choosing to cultivate in certain lands? Why are they choosing to build certain kinds of architecture? And then second, what are the social relationships that farmers within the field system have, and how far do those social relationships stretch? As I mentioned before, this is through the Cooperative Ecosystem Studies Unit that's creating that opportunity for these students. This is a nice place to have a field school, because what I tell students all the time is an agricultural landscape. People have been digging in this location for a long, long time. And I'll talk about the dates that we have in a second. If you screw something up, just let me know and I'll fix it. Because we have that capacity, because this is such a well-structured field school, it's a terrific learning environment for those students. Next slide. We use a range of different methods in this field school. A lot of it is excavation, but we also do a decent amount of survey. As Summer mentioned, part of what this is documenting the spatial distribution of surface architecture. Once the spatial distribution is documented, we can go in and take a closer look at some of these features. There's a variety of reasons why you'd take a look at excavating these features. One of them relates to chronology building. So we need to get organic remains underneath or within some of this architecture in order to radiocarbon date it. That radiocarbon date is going to give us a range from when that organic remain died. And so one of the objectives that we're using is trying to get under these walls, like you see on the right-hand side, obtain charcoal, date that charcoal using radiocarbon dating, and create a chronology. The earliest walls within this project area were built in the 15th century AD, very consistent with what we see in Kohala and Kona. We are also interested in residential structures. So in addition to getting dates from these field systems, we can also look at what people are using and where they're getting resources. They're getting people who are living in this field system are getting resources from Pololu. They were getting resources from Mauna Kea. They were getting resources from Pu'uvava in Kona. And so they were able to create social relationships across the island, or at least get access to material from across the island. And that gives us a better sense of how they're organizing labor, how they're organized their farming, how they're organizing other kinds of economic activities that feed into our understanding of the past. Next slide. One of the big parts of this project, though, is looking at agronomy and looking at agronomy of past land use so that it can be reutilized or utilized in the present. So supporting the management of the park itself. There's a few different ways that we're doing this. One of the more important things with dryland or rain-fed agricultural systems is how people are retaining moisture. And that's what these linear embankments are doing, or walls are doing. That's what you're seeing in the upper left-hand corner. The windward side of the wall, as you can see, is a little bit more dried out, and that's what we'd expect, but that's playing a really important agronomic role. As the wind coming from the east is hitting that wall, it eddies over the wall itself, and that wind then misses the underlying dirt. It misses the actual plot itself, retaining soil moisture in the adjacent plot. This is a little bit different than how these walls are acting in Kohala and Kona. In Kona, they're not acting like this at all. In Kohala, they're capturing mist. They're capturing a lot of moisture coming down the hillside. So we're seeing agronomic adaptations within each of these different field systems. The other thing that I want to point out about the field system on the right-hand side is the relationship between microtopography and how people are choosing to practice agriculture in the past. And so people, individual farmers, have a great deal of traditional ecological knowledge. That traditional ecological knowledge was held by farmers in the past, just like it is now. And so that knowledge about the environment itself gets mapped onto the archaeological record. That's what you're seeing on the right. All the infrastructure in the kipuka itself is built where you have the highest bedrock. The highest bedrock means really shallow soils. And so people are putting in a lot of labor to make those shallow soils arable. They do that because shallow soils dry out a lot quicker. And so that's where you actually need the infrastructure itself. This kind of information and how people used these environments in the past, again, can be used to supplement what we can do now. Finally, the table on the left-hand side looks at the botanical remains that we found in the field system. I want to bring attention to Artocarpus. Artocarpus is ulu. Ulu has been found across the project area. It's a really important economic tree. It's a very highly productive economic tree, and it grows pretty well at this elevation in Ka'u. What this botanical information can be used for is for projects like reforestation. It informs those management decisions that the park has to make, is required to make. And we can have those negotiations about what form those forests should look like, how best to manage those resources, and so on. Next slide.
Okay, I think it's my turn. So this is a great partnership project, as we've been talking about a way to get our Section 110 completed, and Seth is the perfect match for this research and doing an awesome job. And then we're also not just training the students through the field school, the undergraduates, but we're also taking another angle and bringing in the community as well. So we are trying to bring in the local Ka'u schools, as well as we've had some Puna and Kona schools, and we've opened it up to the community also, where we bring in the community members, we bring in the schools, and they participate in the excavations. They get to interact with the archaeologists and learn about what they're doing. This is the descendant community, so many of the kids, maybe their ancestors even built some of these walls and farmed there. So it's connecting the community with the research and having them be a part of it, and also bringing in the ideas of like these indigenous farming methods and how people farm the landscape, because a lot of people are really familiar with the ranching history of the area, but this history people don't really know about. So we're really teaching people more about the previous land use of the area, which is exciting to share. And the park has had some more recent acquisitions of lands in Ka'u. So we've been going out to the community and just asking the community how they want the park to be managed and ideas of what they want to see. And the repeated thing is they want to be involved. They want this community involvement and the stewardship of the lands there. And so this is a great way to build those relationships in the community. Next slide. So we're bringing in all kinds of age ranges, from the elementary kids all the way up to high school, and then the community days, it's anybody and everyone. So that's been great. The location of the site makes it very accessible. We made a safe trail for people to get down to the site in the Kipuka. So that's been a really great way to bring in everyone. It's easy to get to, which not every site is. So this site provides that opportunity. And so I think last summer we had over 200 people participate during the 3 weeks. And then we have 2 more field schools planned for the next summer and the following. And so we're looking forward to bringing in more students and everyone. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, some of the things that we talk about, like inspiring thoughts about farming, the future of farming in Hawaii. I think I've heard the statistics that there's like 3 days of a food supply here on the island if the Matson doesn't come in. So thinking about the future of farming, thinking about how this farming landscape was pretty massive. It must have grown a lot of food. So having the kids think about that. We bring in lessons about the moon calendar and how the moon calendar was used and is used to observe the environment and grow food and fish. And then, just get those kids digging in the dirt and sorting and looking at the artifacts that are found to learn about, career paths in archaeology or in national parks right in their backyard. So just trying to inspire the next generation of cultural resource stewards, maybe NPS stewards. And we also are thinking of maybe some kind of experimental archaeology in the future. The Ka'u High School has a great farming program, and so maybe some kind of training to do some kind of experimental gardens based on these indigenous techniques, and perhaps some of these techniques are future of growing food again here in Hawaii. And so I think that's it for that slide. So just a little bit about the benefits and the outcomes of this project. As I said many times, we're getting our Section 110 baseline documentation and our archaeological inventory survey completed. In this picture, this is the eastern pasture behind the buildings. So you can see it's a pretty large area. So getting that documentation done so that it can help inform our Section 106 process. We're actually right in the middle of planning, doing a site plan for Kahuku. So this is good timing. Future planning of how that area is used and campsites. So it's good to know where our historic properties are for these kind of planning efforts. And just, bringing in the community and having them involved. Some of the things we'll be having come out of this project is some short videos highlighting what we're doing out there, and just really building that relationship with the community more. There's a very special community in the Ka'u district. So forging those relationships with the broader community and with the schools, and highlighting a history that is less known in that area.
we're trying to do is really make archaeology more accessible. How can we make this more accessible? How can we get more people involved in the archaeology and reduce the financial burdens that are associated with archaeology? And so that's where these field schools come from. We're hoping this broadens out that participation. So thank you very much. And that's it for us.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Mara Mulrooney, and I'm a principal and senior archaeologist at Pacific Legacy. That's a tough act to follow, I have to say, hearing about the wonderful work that's happening with UH Manoa and NPS in the Ka'u field system. Today, we're going to shift our focus to another case study. This one comes from a compliance-based perspective, and that is the Barbers Point Solar Project, which is located in Kalaeloa. Go ahead and click to the next slide. So this is where the project's located. It's in the Honouliuli Ahupua'a on Oahu, over on the west side in Ewa. And it's a 163-acre site that consists of 2 discrete parcels. So in the northern and southern parcels there, those were selected for an industrial scale solar project within the boundaries of the former Naval Air Station Barbers Point, which closed in 1999. The owner of these 2 parcels is the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, and the project proponent was Interjex Renewable Energy. So our role as a cultural resource management firm was to assist with compliance with historic preservation review process in accordance with HRS Chapter 6E, which you are all now experts in, thanks to Nicole. So the project was intended to have a solar array in the 2 parcels connected by some subsurface trenching for the electrical line that would then go onto an overhead line that would connect to the HECO or Hawaiian Electric grid. And so that ran along Coral Sea Road. Some people have asked us, why was this selected for a solar project if it's DHHL land and not homesteads? And that's because these, as part of a former naval air station, have some areas of soil contamination. So they're actually not suitable for development as homesteads. Next slide, please. So, of course, with the Chapter 6E historic preservation review process, there are 6 steps. Our role in this project was really included the first 5 steps. So we completed an archaeological inventory survey, focused, of course, on the identification and inventory of historic properties, evaluating their significance, determination of the effect of the project on those historic properties that were identified, and then presenting or proposing mitigation commitments in order to mitigate the impacts of the proposed project on those properties. We also did prepare detailed mitigation plans, which I'll talk a little bit about, but unfortunately, this project was mutually terminated by the Public Utilities Commission and Interjex, so we were unable to reach step 6, which is the verification of completion of those above 5 steps. Next slide, please. So, of course, any archaeological investigation includes a ton of research. And in this presentation, because we're focused on archaeology, we'll just focus on the archaeological research that had been undertaken in this area. So when we started to compile the previous archaeological studies, we noticed that a lot of work had been done in the vicinity of the project area. A lot of that work was as part of the planned closure of the Naval Air Station at Barbers Point. This included 8 previous studies that include the project area. Next slide, please. So of those 8 studies, they identified 8 previously identified historic properties. So historic properties ranging from pre-contact to early post-contact Hawaiian settlement and agricultural use of this area, also some ranching features, and a lot of US military features, as this area was really transformed during the 20th century, beginning in World War II. So an archaeological inventory survey, of course, involves a lot of field work. And so for our methodology, we did a systematic pedestrian survey of 100% of the project area, We were fortunate in that visibility was good in this area, so a lot of sort of low vegetation and a lot of trees, a lot of Hawai trees, especially in this area, some areas of overgrowth, but visibility was generally good. So we were able to get close to that 100% range. We completed full documentation of historic properties. Of course, this included those 8 that had previously been identified. And so we like to joke that we did a lot of archaeology, right? Figuring out correlations between what had been documented back in the 90s when they didn't have as good of GPS technology, for example, and trying to correlate those previously recorded sites or historic properties with what we were seeing on the ground. So this included a lot of written descriptions, lots of measurements, photographs, and scaled maps. And then we also decided to do some subsurface testing via backhoe trench, and that was only in the area of proposed trenching along Coral Sea Road. So as you heard from Nicole, a lot of times the AIS testing strategy is dependent on what the proposed ground disturbance for any given project is going to look like. And so the idea is to target those areas where you're going to have a lot of ground disturbance. And in this instance, as you can see, we're right on the side of the roadway, and we did identify some subsurface cultural layers that were pre-contact Hawaiian cultural layers. We didn't do any site-specific excavation, so at the features that we documented, and that was because extensive subsurface testing had already been done as part of previous studies. So we already had a lot of information from those studies, and we made the decision not to do further testing of those areas. From all of the data that we gathered in the field, we made a project effect determination, significance assessments, and mitigation recommendations. And these were all included in a very large, as you can imagine, AIS report that was subsequently submitted to SHPD. Next slide, please. So in terms of the historic properties, you'll recall that 8 had previously been identified within this project area. We over doubled that number through our survey. We identified 17 historic properties consisting of a whopping 438 individual features. So a very intensively used landscape in this area, both during the pre-contact and early post-contact time by Hawaiians using the area, living in the area, and really thriving in this area. We had habitation features, intensified agricultural features, not quite on the scale of the Ka'u field system, but still a lot of effort going into improving the agricultural capacity of this area. And we also identified some ceremonial features. Over the top of that cultural landscape, we have a lot of US military features, which we identified, and also features with an unknown function. And those namely are unmodified limestone pits, where we know from previous studies that they do tend to include paleontological remains, such as now extinct bird species. They also include agricultural materials and cultural materials, and they are also sometimes the resting place for iwi kupuna or ancestral remains. Next slide. So in terms of the pre-contact and early post-contact features, the largest cluster of those features is located on the most Makai portion of the project area. That is the most seaward portion or southern portion of the project area, with nearby access to freshwater resource at Ori Pond, which is just outside the map frame here on the right-hand side, and Honouliuli's coastal resources, a lot of wonderful resources along the coast that were used, such as limu. The AIS documented 8 sites in the project area, so about half of the identified sites contain pre-contact or early post-contact habitation, agricultural, and ceremonial features. Next slide. So now if we look at the northern parcel of the area, what we see is a lot of military features. And this entire area was part of Marine Corps Base Eva. or MC, Marine Corps Air Station, EVA, sorry. And so what you can see on this historic map is a lot of buildings that used to exist and some of which still exist in this area. So we have 2 historic districts that are already established, including the Eva Plain Battlefield Historic District in the northern portion of the northern parcel, the proposed revetment historic district in the central portion that's outlined in red, and that's adjacent to the Eva Field South revetment historic district, which is already established. So we basically have sort of half of the aircraft revetments, a photo of which you see in the corner here on this slide. Half of them are part of an existing historic district, and there's a proposal to expand that district, right, to include all of the aircraft revetments in the center of that parcel. Now, just adjacent to that, you'll notice a lot of buildings sort of in the lower left-hand corner of the parcel, and that is the CB camp, or the U.S. Navy Construction Battalion Camp, which included a lot of Quonset huts, which were subsequently removed. And so what we have there on the ground is sort of remnants of that area. The CBs, we got to learn a lot about the CBs. They basically were sent out ahead of everybody else in order to construct all of the revetments, the runways, and all of the other components of Marine Corps Air Station, EVA. So quite an exciting history to learn about. Next slide, please. So part of the AIS process involves a lot of consultation, and for this project, we reached out to as many project stakeholders as we could think of. So this included diverse groups of people, included cultural descendants from the area, from Honouliuli, nearby DHHL homestead associations, the Ho'akalei Cultural Foundation, and Kalailoa Heritage Park, 2 very important cultural foundations who work and care for important places nearby, the Kanehili Cultural Hui, and other organizations, including the Oahu Island Burial Council, the Oahu Railway Society, because the transmission line went up and crossed the ORNL Railway, and the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and many others. And so through this consultation process, we did a lot of site visits with people like Shad Kane, who's the director of the Kalailoa Heritage Park. And we also shared a lot of information with people. And so John Bond, for example, who's an amateur historian with the Kanehili Cultural Hui, shared this wonderful photo of what the CB camp looked like previously, which was quite exciting. Next slide, please. So from all of that information, right, talking with people and all of the data that we had gathered, all of the background research that we had done, we, of course, came up with a project effect with agreed upon mitigation commitments, because we knew that some of the identified historic properties would be impacted by this project. We also developed mitigation recommendations, including preservation, archaeological data recovery in the form of archival research, which is another form of recovering information or data, as well as no further work for a few of the military features, which had been fully documented by the AIS and previous studies by historic architects. Archaeological monitoring was recommended for the project, for the entire project during construction as well. So I'd like to sort of narrow in on just one of the AIS outcomes and benefits, and that centers on this very large feature that you see in pink here, which is feature 34 of SIHP 5106. It was originally recorded as part of a World War II military training complex. It's a very large walled enclosure that is filled with sand. And when Tuggle and Tominari Tuggle did the original survey in this area, they recommended that the, quote, rough enclosures be mapped and tested. It is probable that most or all of the enclosures are military construction, but the possibility that some are modified Hawaiian structures needs to be evaluated. And so as we went back in the field and our team of archaeologists was completing the documentation of all of the historic property features that we identified, you know, they arrived to this very large enclosure and they were kind of scratching their heads because they looked at these walls and they thought to themselves, these don't look like military walls. These look like Hawaiian walls. And subsequent to our initial pedestrian survey, we returned to this area with Shad Kane and a group from the Kalailoa Heritage Park. And Uncle Shad, of course, said, well, yes, of course these are Hawaiian walls. This is a kahua. And suddenly it was like, you know, a light bulb went off and we said, well, of course it is, right? And so a kahua is an open space that's used for sports and games during makahiki, which is an annual period marked by sporting competitions and religious festivities, as well as a kapu on war. So it's really the time of Lono, who is the kua of agriculture. And so when you look at this kahua in a wider context, you see that there's a very large cluster of intensified agricultural mounds and storage features, which makes perfect sense. If it's a place of gathering and festivities, of course, you need to be able to feed everybody as they're there. And so, you know, this area, based on the previous interpretation as a military feature, actually was included as an area where solar arrays would be in the original design. And we were able to call the project proponent and say, oh my gosh, you absolutely cannot place solar arrays here. We need to preserve this feature. This is a very highly significant feature to the Hawaiian community. Next slide, please. And so through the AIS, huge outcome and benefit was being able to update the records and the interpretations for previously identified historic properties like this one. We were also able to update significance assessments and mitigation recommendations and develop those in very close consultation with project stakeholders. So you'll remember the CB camp, for example. Previous archaeologists had identified that as not significant, and we were able to update that significance assessment to significant under criterion D, which means that it has yielded or has potential to yield information about the past. With the kahua, in the case of the kahua, we were also able to update the significance in consultation with our consulting parties to be significant under both criterion D and criterion E, which is specific to Hawaii and Chapter 6E, and that is because it is very important to the Native Hawaiian community. This site in particular was recommended for preservation in the form of appropriate cultural use. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So, you know, in terms of the updated inventory of historic properties, we now have a full inventory for all of the historic property features in this area, which includes not only updated information, but also we were able to put together all of the known information that had been recorded over the years by archaeologists working here. We planned data recovery to learn more about the cultural use of the area, especially archaeological data recovery in the limestone pits, and archival data recovery for those military features. In total, about over 75% of the features were recommended for preservation in various forms. Many of them were recommended for preservation by avoidance and protection. And so on this map, you can see the green areas are those buffers that are both the interim and the long-term buffers surrounding those features. We recommend the recommended appropriate cultural use for the kahua so that it could be reactivated for makahiki activities by the Hawaiian community today. And we also recommended adaptive reuse for military features in consultation with SHPD. So for example, you see one of the magazines here. perfect storage location for project equipment, for example, and not impacting the structural integrity of that feature, sort of like the photo that you saw of the revetment that's currently being used by Barbers Point Stables. So in terms of stewardship of these places, the establishment of buffers around all of the preservation features and the long-term stewardship or the maintenance of those historic properties and the surrounding area was a huge benefit that we saw for this project in particular in the AIS. Next slide, please. So of course, every project comes with its own challenges. Here we were documenting an area with a lot of varied cultural usage and we spoke with a lot of a diverse group of stakeholders who had varied historic preservation priorities. So some advocated for the preservation of military features and others advocated for the preservation of Hawaiian features. And so that's always a challenge, right? When you're talking to diverse groups and they have varied priorities and respecting and honoring those priorities and recommendations. Of course, staying on track with project timeline and milestones was a big one. This is one of many projects that contributes to Hawaii, the state of Hawaii's goal to be 100% renewable by 2045. And so what comes with that is some tight timelines and milestones that need to be adhered to. And of course, balancing project design needs and historic preservation. So as you take away areas of solar arrays, you have to make sure that the project is still viable to move forward and produce enough energy for the community. Next slide. And this is my final slide, lessons learned. I could talk about lessons learned all day, but one that we learned from this project in particular is that you can't assume that previous archaeological investigations identified all historic properties within a project area, especially if they were completed many decades ago. So this is why SHPD asks that archaeological inventory surveys be done that are specific to the proposed project. And if an AIS was done in the past and it was done over a decade ago, generally speaking, they'll request that a new AIS be completed for that project. Another lesson learned, start planning as early as possible and factor the historic preservation review process into the project's timeline. Of course, it takes a lot of time to do research, complete field work, to synthesize all of the information, and then for SHPD's team to review a 1,000-page report. So keeping in mind that review process does take time, and it takes time to move through all of those 6 steps of the historic preservation review process. It is a process. Big one, of course, maintaining open and frequent communication. In this instance, we were fortunate to be working with a team who was open to, changing the project design because of historic preservation needs. And so that was huge, just being able to communicate and also with project stakeholders, with the community. If an archaeological firm reaches out to you and says, we're working on this project, we'd like to consult with you, even if you don't have time to do site visits or, meet with them, stay tuned, right? Stay in communication with them and stay informed about the projects that are happening around you. And then, of course, building flexibility into the project design for any project is just so beneficial so that we can ensure that historic properties are preserved and stewarded for the future. Thanks so much.
Great. What wonderful presentations. Thank you all of the presenters for very informative and excellent presentations. So much to think about. At this point, we want to bring together our speakers and reintroduce our additional panelist, EO. So if you could turn on your cameras and I think, I don't know if we got Summer back. Summer was rebooting her computer to see if she could get her microphone back. And I don't know that she's back yet or not, but hopefully we'll get Summer here. So I have a number of prompts for our panel that address the nature of archaeology in Hawaii and where we think the field is going. Because of the time, we probably won't get to hear from all of the panelists for every question, but everyone will be able to answer some of the questions. So, and address some of the prompts. So after I ask a prompting question, the presenters that would like to take a stab at it, please raise your hand, with the caveat that if nobody raises their hand, I'm going to call on somebody. So our first prompt, our presentations today explored both academic research in archaeology at a National Park Service site, as well as a really great example of a cultural resources management program on Ewa Plains. So the question is, what are some of the pros and cons of these types of archaeology, and kind of maybe what are some of the differences? Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, I
Seth.
can, Doug.
There we
Yeah.
go. Good.
One of the things that's different, Mara and I have talked about this, and others have talked about this too, is organizational principles. And so, site numbers and site boundaries are incredibly important for the organization of cultural resources, particularly for the State Historic Preservation Office, but also for the national park. On the academic side, site boundaries don't mean much of anything. Um, and most of the interpretation that happens at finer scales. So we're looking at it from a feature level. We're looking at it from a component of a piece of architecture level and looking at the distributions of those things rather than the site boundaries, which are a little bit more arbitrary in some cases, though not always. And so how we organize the actual field work and how we record stuff is going to vary a little bit on that.
Doug, you muted.
Anyone else want to take that one on?
So since I'm the I presented the case study from CRM, I think that one of the challenges that we face is that we are only looking in a discrete project area, right? And so what you noticed with the Barbers Point Solar project area is that some of those site boundaries did extend outward. And it can be a real challenge when you're only doing an AIS of a particular parcel. And you can see that the distribution of historic property features extends beyond that boundary, but we are constrained, right? We're constrained by that particular project. And so one of the challenges that we face as a professional community is, having a complete and comprehensive database of all of those sites. And that's something that SHPD is currently working on. Their GIS team is currently working on that. They launched their new HiCRIS system, which is actually GIS based, which is a phenomenal resource in terms of a repository of that information. And so, speaking from the CRM side, it can be difficult to group those features into discrete sites, especially when you're working in an area that's been used for various things over a very long period of time. So those are some of the constraints from the CRM perspective.
That's great. And I see Summer, you're back. Is your microphone working okay?
Yep, I'm all back online. I had to reboot, so I'm good.
Fantastic. We're talking about the differences between CRM and academic archaeology, and maybe you have a perspective from the National Park Service side of that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the the park has a different, we're a preservation agency. So luckily we don't really have to deal with large developments and things like that. So basically our inventories and research really feeds into park management, the different aspects of park management and the 106 process that we go through for any of the undertakings that happen in the park. But we're pretty lucky, as most of our efforts are just for preservation. Like I said, we don't have large developments usually within parks. Sometimes parks do, but yeah, so that's our real focus in the park is that angle of things. So yeah.
And
I could share something.
sure.
So I got into archaeology through a field school called Wahikupuna Internship Program in 2009. And it was aiming to get Native Hawaiians and locals into the field of cultural resource management by focusing in community-based approaches, culturally sensitive methodologies, and being qualified to do archaeological work in Hawaii. So it's very important. You have, you're pretty open on how archaeology is conducted. You're pretty flexible in integrating cultural, perspectives and methodologies in these spaces. But when you go into the compliance, it's very clear of what Nicole went through with the HARs, HRS. And that culture has been, it has its own culture that has developed over the years since it started. So it's very specific, and it's not really based on community-based approaches. And so our academic archaeology and compliance is essentially the two ways archaeology is done in Hawaii. And they interact with SHPE, or the State Historic Preservation Division, in different ways because of it. But they're very important, and they go hand in hand to ensure that, we have people from Hawaii going into these careers. They are aware of the intricacies of the community issues and development and compliances. And it's from a community-based approach. So that's my little comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Summer.
I just wanted to add one more thing about the park is, this kind of research and these inventories also feeds into our park interpretation and our themes that we share out with the visitors that come. So having all the information of the different layers of history is important for us, so that we can kind of have this science communication where we have a lot of this type of research done, and then we can communicate it out to the public because it's public lands, and so people are eager to hear about the stories and want to know. So when we get new information, like from the archaeologist that Seth is doing research, or in any other project, we can utilize that information and share that out with the public in different formats, either in interpretive tours or on the web and short videos. So that's part of how it kind of feeds into park management as well.
Great. Okay, Nicole, real quick.
Okay. I just wanted to add really quickly that, from the CRM side, development is the driver for archaeology. So, it's more of a reactive process, and it would be nice if it was more of a proactive process. So that is one of the things that I would say is not as beneficial. But one of the things that I found to be a positive about it is that we are finding out all the different kinds of archaeology across the islands, right? So if someone goes in for permitting, they're going to do work on their parcel, then someone has to go out and do archaeology. And that has allowed us to gain more information versus if you're going to do it for, for a state park or something smaller, that's not on that level. Yeah. But unfortunately it is reactive.
That is true. It's 106, but the and 6E for there were some questions earlier on in the program that kind of were questioning about who's responsible for making decisions, and the section 106 is very different from the 6E process. And so with 106, you have to remember that there's a federal agency official. Sometimes that's delegated to a state official, but usually it's a federal agency person who actually is making the decisions, and they're required to ask SHPD and ask Native Hawaiian organizations and seek other input from people that are connected to the process before they make that decision, and they have to document it. So that's kind of the checks and balances with 106. It's a little bit different from 6E. So our second prompt, in the past 30 years, there's been quite a bit more emphasis by archaeologists to reach out to descendant communities and Native Hawaiian organizations, as well as working with agencies and property owners. Some would argue that we have a long way to go, however. So how can archaeologists better collaborate with Native Hawaiian organizations and descendant communities, as well as agencies and property owners, to maximize preservation while still facilitating needed projects? Summer.
I can talk about that with the Park Service. So, through our 106 process, it is required to do consultation, but also it's just, I think, it's not just checking off a box, it's actually building those relationships and having those deep conversations. And so I think part of it is the relationship building through that process. So you have one project, you need to consult on, you build relationships over time. So that's the most important part, I think, for 106 is bringing in the community more and, reaching out as far as you can to see who wants to participate. And then, having those Native Hawaiian community meetings and getting that feedback. And so like with the Park Service, we have a Kapuna consultation group that we meet with regularly. And so I think the most important thing, and we're lucky here at the park to have a lot of people that have worked here for a long time. And so just having those relationships established is important, I think, for these types of things.
Sure, Peter.
Yeah, 30 years is sort of an easy one for me to keep track of. It's when I was working on Kauai at that point, finishing my PhD work. The state of Hawaii had just gone through the H3 highway project, which was pretty much a debacle in terms of federal historic preservation process. And it had caused a great deal of distrust. And before that had been in the late 1980s, had been Honokahua Maui. And by 2000, we had a state administration that came in that had pretty much ran an audit on the State Historic Preservation Division office and had a new director come in. And before long, a staff of over 30 people, many with PhDs who had been there for many years, by 2002 were pretty much gone from the office, and there had been a large turnover. And I think it's taken a long time for a community to establish trust in how this process is working. And I think a number of things over the last 30 years have helped build that trust. One is sincere efforts by many of the firms involved to engage in more systematic consultation, more engagement by with the private archaeological consulting firms, not to have people hired from the mainland are coming in for an exotic chance to come and work in Hawaii with no connection to community, but are actually finding people who are trained in archaeological work and field work with a descendant community connections already built, and to try to go in those directions. So all of those things I think are objective, positive things that we can turn to see how things are improving compared to, I'd say, I sort of put the low point at about 2002. But with everything, people have long memories, and the problems that show up with increased development and having important cultural sites still disappearing as new development takes place in different places, it's always going to create tension. And I think the main thing that we have in facing the new tensions is making certain that we maintain some consistency in terms of the people who are out there who have built trustful relationships, and to make certain that we maintain integrity in how we do our jobs. I can remember there was a early there was a SHPD archaeologist named Mark Smith who's since passed away, and one of the things I can remember him saying, even at a low point, is that some of the larger firms, development firms in Hawaii, not consulting firms, but the development firms, had actually learned that it was better to hire firms that weren't going to do the bare minimum. That firms that actually were going to try to make certain that they were above the minimum standards and their reports wouldn't be held up as long. And I think that as you see new developers come in who don't know that rule, they're still looking to try to find an underbid, that would basically get them through a process on the front side that looks really good as far as the initial cost, but probably leads to longer issues in terms of approvals and legal cases and other things that might be brought up if shoddy work's going on. So I'd like to encourage us all to make certain that we continue to try to focus on the reasons why we do this work at all. And I would like to tell anybody out there who's listening, read the opening statement to chapter 6E, like the statement of like why this law exists. And it almost still makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck a little bit, because it's written almost like, you're reading like the Declaration of Independence. We recognize that these resources are disappearing at an alarming rate due to development. And our purpose is to try to find some way to try to stop that process from going just rampantly and say what's most important. And if we can keep in mind that even though that opening objective of 6E, I tell my students all the time that we have laws, we have regulations, and then we have the reality of what actually happens. And I think the reality sometimes does fall short of what the laws were intended for. And I think that kind of distrust that comes out of that process is part of the problem. But I do think that many of the people involved in the field now, 30 years later, are more connected to community, and that has to be a big, big positive thing.
Yeah, I agree with you, Peter. That's the requirement to consultation, as well as some of the laws that have emerged, have forced archaeologists to have to actually talk to people, and that's a really good thing. And I think it's in many cases, particularly for people that have been involved in a long process of doing archaeology, they have been able to build relationships with people that is really critical. Is there anybody else who would like to say something about that last one? Mara.
Sure. I would just add, really building off of Nicole's statement that it is reactive, that it seems like in the past, I don't know, couple of decades, right, that we've been more proactive, right? We've been more proactive in going out and consulting with communities, talking with people about the projects that we're working on, working together with them to establish, significance assessments and mitigation recommendations. And I'd also just like to add that SHPD has actually upped the caliber of CRM reports over the last couple of decades. And that's very much thanks to Susan Lebo, who's the archaeology branch chief at the State Historic Preservation Division, who is demanding more. And we all appreciate that, right? Because it is ensuring that the compliance-based work that's done in the field of archaeology in Hawaii is of a higher quality than it was 30 years ago. So I just wanted to add that has been a very big shift in the field of compliance-based archaeology in the state.
Great. So our third prompt, there's been over 100 years of archaeology in the Hawaiian Islands. Emerging issues in archaeology include ethics, the role of the public and communities, like we've just been talking about, and how we recruit, develop, and better support careers in archaeology. From the standpoint of these issues, in your view, what is the future of archaeology in Hawaii? I'm going to pick somebody. Oh, there we go. Summer.
I can talk a little bit. Um, I mean, for myself and the park and working with staff and the community, just really focusing efforts on inspiring and training up that next generation um, of stewards in archaeology and even in the national park here. I was in a meeting recently with a lot of people we looked around and I said, you know what? Everybody in this room, we've all worked here for about 20 years and we're all going to retire at the same time. We need to like really focus our efforts on training up that next generation of stewards. So I think, you know, that's important. And what EO said is like bringing in the cultural protocols and all those things going forward is important, and having our, you know, community be involved too. And yeah, just kind of training, that angle of training and how we're doing things differently now and how they should be done going forward is something that I try to focus on here at the park, and bringing in interns and yeah, pass, you know, when it's time to pass the torch, we need to be ready. So
Peter?
Well, yeah, since I'm the oldest, I think on this panel right now, or in terms of the archaeology in Hawaii, I feel that speaking about the future, I wanted to stay quiet and in my mind, the future speak, as opposed to have me speak about what the future is and what it should be. I do hope that one of the big things that continues to unfold is sort of what EO was talking about later, that we see archaeology being driven not by a definition that came out of a textbook in 1948 back on the mainland, but archaeology being huli koehana, being something that's embraced in a Hawaiian cosmology in a way that allows people to with reverence and appropriate respect approach ancestral places and have those ancestral places speak to people in ways where which can be where the tools of archaeology help that speech to be heard. In other words, that you understand what's the difference between a flake and a fire-cracked rock from knowing what those things look like. You know the difference when you go into a lava tube between iwi kupuna and a goat bone, and that you have the skills to be able to understand what is there in a way that allows that place to speak more clearly. And I think that that sort of transformation from a patriarchal field filled with old codgers who were raised somewhere else to one which is actually being led by Hawaiian community members itself is where I hope to see the field going. And that's really what we've been striving for all along. And one of the reasons I want to retire early is I want to help that process along, and try to get to the point that we have more representation across the board than what we have right now. It's improved, but it still has a ways to go.
I have a comment.
Great.
Yeah, I feel I'm pretty hopeful for the future. I feel there's a lot of plans that have been in motion. Like Peter setting up his the heritage management program at UH. The people that I'm involved with, Huli'au Pa'a, and the Huli'au Pa'a nonprofit, and the efforts that they've been doing for over the years. And so we can start to see the fruits of people's labor and seeing things change and seeing more engagement. When I went into college, I didn't even know archaeology was possible to explore as a career. But now people are understanding that it is a career, and understanding that, we can have some say in it on how it's done, how it's conducted, and who gets involved. So I'm really, I'm hopeful. Um, I really, I value public education, public outreach, is because people need to understand how to engage in the process. We do have all this consultation from Section 106 and 6E, but it's very direct on what type of comments are provided in that process. It evolves around a lot of historic properties in the project, but a lot of people don't fully understand, and they talk about environmental stuff. And so there's a lot of education that needs to be done so that we can have these meaningful consultations and engagement, and then have these comments incorporated into the decision making in all these projects that are being done, and not have consultation treated as just part of the compliance. We talk so and so, and then the knowledge, just sits on a shelf. There's no accountability of engaging to that community, and no follow-up, but it's kind of a take kind of mentality. So I feel like it's changing, but there is a lot of work. Just how archaeology is done is triggered by development. That whole process, it's going to be very hard to make changes of how, and just how that is done. There's a whole culture within that. But I'm hopeful, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I had a fourth prompt, but we're almost out of time here. I'm wondering if there's anything from the questions from the audience that we could answer. I saw one on certified local governments, and a certified local government is a program whereby either a local county or a city can get recognition from the federal government. There's a tiny bit of money that comes with it, often through granting, and they hold a inventory of locally significant resources, as well as participate in helping to determine the significance of National Register properties. And certainly in terms of that includes archaeological sites, and often there's an archaeologist on board with that. And certainly you would think of them as somebody to consult with if you had, say, a federal undertaking that was within that county or within that city. Any other thoughts on certified local governments? There is the website on certified local governments that you can gather more information, and we can provide that as well. Andrea, I haven't been tracking the chat as much. Are there any salient questions out there that our group could answer?
Yeah, Doug, I just sent you a direct message through the chat with 3 or 4 questions, including the certified local government. And folks, I'll put that link in the chat now so you can learn more about what the CLG represents. So Doug, let me know if you don't see those. And
Yeah, I see those, and I'm going to maybe do one more. Oh, good. Elaine plugged in the chat link to the CLG, Certified Local Governments. One question is equitable recognition of community members who are Indigenous and local knowledge holders via co-authorship, dedicated budget lines, etc., is increasingly being applied in community-centered environmental stewardship. Is there any momentum in archaeology? Seth.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of momentum. There's several journals now that require that kind of co-authorship within archaeology and anthropology. It's growing. It needs to grow more. So there's that momentum. The other momentum that I see too is as far as equitable recognition is thinking about how you construct the budget. And so I'm thinking about collective benefits and public benefits that are part of archaeology. And so if you're working on an agricultural landscape, putting money in for experimental gardening, or at least working with organizations that can promote experimental gardening, making sure that you're creating room for those other kinds of projects that have longer lives than just the archaeological project, I think is really quite important. And then obviously co-authorship, particularly when we're using traditional ecological knowledge, that is generally the norm now in the field. It certainly wasn't in the past, but it's quite expected that if you are using that, that you put people on as authors.
Any other thoughts on that one?
We have been doing that a little more here at the park at Hawaii Volcanoes, is kind of doing one project, but in two parallel realms where you do the archaeology as well as like the anthropology, more of the indigenous local knowledge, or maybe taking a deeper dive into like chants or anything that might be related to that site. So it's kind of a multidisciplinary type of approach. So we're hoping to do that more in the future.
Great. Well, we're about at the end of our time. I want to thank everyone for coming today. Thanks so much to our presenters and our panelists for their insights and expertise in this overview of archaeology. I hope that you've gained some knowledge about the types of investigations that archaeologists conduct, archaeology's role in preservation and long-term site stewardship. We saw a variety of projects in Hawaii that use archaeological investigations, and hopefully have given you a basic understanding of archaeological practice. For those craving more information, there are additional readings and reference materials on the Historic Hawaii Foundation website where you registered for this course. And then, Kirsten, do you have any last words for us?
I want to share my mahalo to all of you for being part of today's discussion. It's been really informative, very interesting. For all of our participants and our guests, we will be posting the slideshow as well as the recording to historichawaii.org and also to the Historic Hawaii YouTube channel if you want to relive this or watch it on demand or share it with others. And we'll send out the links after everything is posted as well. I also would ask everyone to complete the post-event survey that should pop up after the Zoom ends. And that really helps us to know how our programs are received. And if there are areas that you're interested in learning more about, please be sure to put that in. And really, this is our final public program for the calendar year. We're really excited to look at 2025. We will have a full slate of educational presentations starting in January. So we look forward to seeing all of you again. And I just want to thank everyone for being part of this today. Mahalo.